I stood in the doorway, hesitant, holding a gift bag that felt heavier than it should. Clara's laughter carried from the kitchen, light and melodic, as though she didn't have a care in the world. But the figure by the fireplace's figure stopped me cold. Sebastian. He looked every bit as devastating as the first time we met. Tall, confident, utterly at ease in the cozy room as he adjusted the stockings hanging on the mantle. His sweater, dark green and fitted just enough, made him look like he'd stepped out of a holiday dream. A dream I had no business having. Brandon. Clara's voice jolted me from my thoughts as she appeared with a bottle of wine in one hand and a grin that could warm the iciest night. I thought you'd flake. I almost did, I admitted, my voice steadier than I felt. Sebastian turned then, his gaze locking onto mine. It wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It lingered, too long, too knowing. My pulse stuttered, and I quickly looked away, mumbling something about the snow piling up on the driveway. Clara waved it off. That storm's keeping everyone else stuck, so it's just the three of us for now. More wine for me. She laughed, breezing past me, and I stepped into the room fully, regretting every second. Sebastian hadn't moved. Glad you made it, he said softly. There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that unsettled me more than the storm outside. Yeah, I muttered, avoiding his gaze. Wouldn't miss it. Lie. Because I had buried this, whatever this was. But now, in the flickering glow of the fire, with Clara's voice fading into the kitchen and Sebastian standing too close to the edge of my thoughts, I knew tonight wouldn't let it stay buried. 2. The room fell into a comfortable silence as Clara excused herself to take a call. Her cheerful voice faded down the hallway, leaving just me and Sebastian in the living room. I busied myself with the gift bag, fumbling with the ribbon to avoid meeting his eyes. Sebastian crouched by the hearth, coaxing life into the fire. The crackle of wood filled the space, an intimate sound that seemed louder without Clara's chatter. Storm's really picking up, Sebastian said, his voice low and smooth, breaking the quiet. I glanced at the window, where snowflakes tumbled in chaotic spirals. Yeah, doesn't look like anyone else will make it tonight. That means more food for us, he joked, but his laugh lacked conviction. I sat down, unsure whether to respond. He shifted, leaning back on his heels, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. You doing okay? He asked, catching me off guard. Yeah, I said quickly, too quickly. Why wouldn't I be? He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the flames. You seem distant. Distant was safer, I thought. Just tired from the drive. He didn't press, but there was a weight in the air, a pull I couldn't ignore. Sebastian stood, brushing his hands on his jeans, and crossed to the side table. Mulled wine, he asked, holding up the decanter Clara had left behind. Sure, I replied, hoping my voice sounded casual. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to me. As I reached for it, our hands met briefly, skin against skin, warm and electric. My breath hitched, and I prayed he hadn't noticed, but he had. His eyes flicked to mine, holding me there for a heartbeat too long. I looked away, taking a sip of the wine to hide the flush rising in my cheeks. Clara's been really excited about the wedding, I said, desperate to steer the conversation somewhere safe. Sebastian let out a quiet sigh, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Yeah, she has. There was something in his tone, a crack in the facade. I turned to him, watching as he swirled the wine in his glass. You don't sound excited, I said before I could stop myself. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. It's complicated. The word hung between us, a thread of hope I couldn't afford to pull. But it was there, undeniable, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd misread everything. The silence stretched until he broke it. Can I ask you something personal? I froze, the wineglass poised halfway to my lips. Depends on the question, I said carefully, my heart pounding in anticipation. The question hung in the air, charged and heavy. I set my glass down, trying to appear calm, though my pulse betrayed me, thudding in my ears like a warning. Do you ever feel like you're living a life that doesn't quite fit? Sebastian asked, his voice quiet, almost tentative. I glanced at him, his eyes reflecting the firelight, shadows dancing across his face. There was a vulnerability in his expression I hadn't seen before, a crack in the confident exterior he always wore. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I replied, carefully neutral, though the weight of his words pressed against my chest. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's like, I should be happy. Clara's amazing, you know, but something feels off. Like I'm playing a role that's not mine. The words struck me harder than I expected, stirring something deep inside. I tried to keep my face blank, but the truth was clawing its way out. Maybe it's not about the role, I said softly. Maybe it's about who you're playing it with. His head turned sharply, eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the space between us almost non-existent. A flood of memories surged forward, unbidden. The first time I met Sebastian, when Clara introduced him at a family dinner, and I couldn't stop staring at the way his smile lit up the room. The countless moments after his laughter, his easy charm, the way he always seemed to notice when I needed a refill or a kind word. Each one a tiny betrayal of my sister, each one a secret I buried deeper than the last. I blinked, shaking myself from the memory, but the air between us had shifted. Sebastian had leaned closer, his glass forgotten on the table. "Brandon," he said, my name a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "You shouldn't," I started, but he cut me off, his voice low and raw. "There's something about you, Brandon. I can't explain it, but it's there. I feel it." My heart thundered in my chest, and I knew I should step back, say something to break the spell. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment stretched endlessly, his gaze pulling me in, erasing the lines I'd sworn I'd never cross. Then, the sound of Clara's footsteps shattered the quiet, her voice calling out as she re-entered the room. Sebastian shifted back abruptly, his face a careful mask, though his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. I turned away, gripping the edge of the couch to steady myself. "Everything okay in here?" Clara asked, her tone light but her gaze sharp as it flicked between us. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just talking about the storm." She didn't respond, but the weight of her suspicion lingered, pressing down like the snow outside, as if she could sense the crack in the foundation of this evening. The air in the room felt heavier as we gathered around the small table for the exchange of gifts. The tree lights blinked in gentle rhythm, but their warmth did little to ease the tension. Clara's excitement filled the silence as she reached for the first package, her laughter ringing out like bells against the quiet strain between Sebastian and me. I kept my eyes on the mug of mulled wine cradled in my hands, the scent of spices doing little to calm the turmoil within. Sebastian sat across from me, his posture casual, but his avoidance spoke volumes. Clara unwrapped a scarf, exclaiming her gratitude, but her cheer dimmed as she looked between us. "You two are unusually quiet tonight," she said, half teasing, though there was an edge to her tone. I forced a chuckle, just tired from the drive, like I said. She murmured, unconvinced, before standing abruptly. "I'll check on the storm again, see if anyone else might still make it." The door creaked softly behind her, and suddenly, it was just the two of us again. I set my glass down with a shaky hand and looked at Sebastian, who stared at the fire as though it held all the answers. "We need to stop," I said, my voice breaking the uneasy stillness. "Stop what?" he asked, his gaze finally meeting mine. His calm exterior was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "What's wrong with wanting something real?" "Sebastian," I said, the name heavy on my tongue. Whatever this is, it can't happen. Why not?" He pressed, leaning forward, his voice dropping. "Because it's easier to pretend you don't feel it, or because you think it's wrong." The heat of his words, the firelight catching in his eyes, made it impossible to look away. He stood, moving closer, the space between us shrinking with each step. My breath caught as he reached out, his hand hovering near mine. "You don't have to lie to me," he said softly. I stepped back, my heart racing, torn between the pull of him and the guilt gnawing at me. "We can't do this, not like this." His lips parted as if to argue, but the door creaked open, and Clara's voice filled the room again. "The snow's not letting up," she said, brushing frost from her coat. She froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing as they darted between Sebastian and me. Her smile faltered, confusion darkening her features. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone light but her expression anything but. Neither of us answered, the weight of her question settling over the room like the snow outside. Clara's question hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. The warmth of the fire seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating tension. "What's going on?" she repeated, her voice steady but cold. I scrambled for something to say, some excuse that would make sense, but nothing came. My silence betrayed me. It's my fault, Sebastian said, stepping forward. His tone was quiet but firm, his eyes fixed on Clara. I've developed feelings for Brandon. The room seemed to tilt, Clara's face crumpling as his words sank in. Her shoulders stiffened, her hand gripping the back of a chair as if for support. Feelings, she echoed, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Clara, I started, but she cut me off with a look so sharp it left me breathless. You knew, she said, her gaze burning into me. You knew, and you let this happen. I tried to protest, to explain, but my words fell apart under the weight of her heartbreak. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I deserve better than this, she said, her voice quiet but resolute, from both of you. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the cabin, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. I stood frozen, guilt clawing at me, but Sebastian stepped closer. Brandon, he said softly, his voice breaking through the storm of emotions in my head. I turned to him, and the look in his eyes made my chest ache. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice raw, but I can't regret it. His hand brushed mine, tentative, seeking, and I didn't pull away. He leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It felt like stepping into something unknown, terrifying but undeniable. When we pulled apart, the sound of the door creaking open shattered the fragile moment. Clara stood there, her coat soaked, snow clinging to her hair. Her expression was no longer furious, it was resolved. Sebastian, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the cold seeping into the room. Leave. He hesitated, his gaze flicking to me, but she didn't waver. I won't marry someone who isn't fully committed to me, she continued. And you clearly aren't. The words were final, cutting through any lingering arguments. Sebastian nodded, his face unreadable, and gathered his things. As he stepped outside, he glanced back at me one last time, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. I stood by the window, watching him disappear into the snow, his scarf clutched tightly in my hand. Clara's voice broke the silence. This isn't over, Brandon, for any of us. Her words hung in the air as I stared into the storm, the weight of the night settling over me. Life is messy, love is complicated, and choices have consequences. If you were Brandon, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. We are Pride Stories Unfiltered, your #1 pride.